Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Welcome to Business Over Breakfast, and thank you for joining us today and kicking off Cinco de Mayo with us. In fact, this is the third time we have, the third Cinco de Mayo that we have had Business Over Breakfast. Which sort of seems crazy because we started this session with Tom Smith the month after the pandemic. So we had no idea that we would still be doing Business Over Breakfast, over 2 years later. The purpose of Business Over Breakfast then and now was to help us sort through what effect the sort of critical global events are having on the economy, on ourselves personally, on our organizations and companies. And so joining us today is Professor Tom Smith and his colleague and friend, Dr. Bill McKinnon. And the big question that they'll be exploring is whether we are in a recession or not. I hope the answer is or not. And what should we expect for the rest of the year given the current global situation? For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'd like to share a little bit about our faculty. Tom Smith is a finance faculty here at Goizueta Business School. He's an expert in labor economics, pricing, sports economics, financing, the economics of entertainment industry and healthcare, and is working with us on a program for dentists, which is very exciting. Bill McKinnon is the CEO and founder of Capitalytics. I should know that by now. That is an integrated business intelligence service for bankers. And Bill has a deep background and lots of degrees in technology, telecom, and technology ventures. And he is a student of the economy and the Goizueta MBA alum. Both of these gentlemen are constant learners, and the fact that you all are here this morning on Business Over Breakfast indicates that you are too. So let me just tell you a couple of things that we have coming up that you might be interested in. For those of you in finance and or marketing, the registrations for our 4 credit programs, our extended learning courses, where you'd learn alongside the MBAs, the executive and the evening MBAs, are now open, or open tomorrow, I believe. So classes start at the end of August. These are 4 credit, but there are only a few seats, so please take a look at those on our website. Applications are also open for the graduate coaching diploma. So check that out if you are interested in developing coaching skills and adding that to your leadership toolkit. And last but not least, for those that, like me, need to sort of get on to the cutting edge of what's happening in business in terms of technology and the applications and the opportunities that can afford us, Jesse Boxstead is got a program coming up in August on AI and machine learning for business. So for those that really need to understand what's happening in that space and how do I leverage that technology for insights that will influence my business strategy, that's one to think about. As for today's session, Tom and Bill are going to kick off with some thoughts about what's happening in the and then, as usual, we'll open for Q&A. So please put those into the Q&A session, and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. So Tom, Bill, over to you.
Hey there. Thank you, Nicola. I appreciate you having us on again. You mentioned that we started this about 2 years ago. It's actually the first Business Over Breakfast participant, panelist, if you will. And it's been an interesting ride. And I'd like to say that today, like what we're experiencing right now in the economy is really a culmination of what started 2 years ago. And I don't think this should surprise anybody. Where it is now is really a buildup of lots of things. And so, like Nicola mentioned, I'm here with my colleague and friend, former student Bill McKinnon, very, very smart individual, and somebody who has, I think, a very pragmatic look at the economy. And so he and I talk about the trend of the economy, what stats are important, how the numbers are looking, where we think policy is going, and we talk about the economy maybe every day. Sometimes we delay every other day, but we're constantly thinking about it. And so that's why, I've brought him on board to engage with us, because he's so good at thinking about these things in such a pragmatic way. And so, Bill, how you doing this morning?
Good, I'm good. Thanks, Tom, and thank you, Nicola, for the introduction. I'm not sure that's the best thing to be saying, Tom, that we're talking multiple times a day about the economy, but
I think that's where the economy's at, right?
unfortunately, yeah. So we put together some notes to kind of guide a little bit of the conversation. I'm going to go ahead and throw something up on the share. And there we are. How's that?
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Great. All right. So just kind of to, like I say, guide the conversation, the discussion, the main things that we've been talking about. In fact, Tom, you and I were here almost exactly a year ago, talking about, we were deep in the throes of COVID. I guess we were coming out of the Delta strain of COVID and starting to get into Omicron. But just like you said, where we are now is really the culmination of where we've been, of the path we've taken over the past couple of years, trying to navigate the COVID pandemic crisis.
Yeah. So is there the next slide? I think, does this highlight? Okay. So I know I want to sort of jumping ahead a little bit. So everybody, I don't know if everybody on this call knows. So yesterday, the Federal Reserve Board met, and they increased the federal funds rate target by 50 basis points, which means like 0.5%. The market, stock market, dropped as a result of this, but not because they did this, but because everybody had built in a 75 basis point increase, and the Fed was not as aggressive. And so there was a back and forth from a lot of people about, is the Fed being too dovish? Is this a different kind of maneuver that they're doing? We thought they were going to be more aggressive. So remember that we're experiencing 8.5% year over year inflation. This is the highest inflation rate we've had since the early 1980s, coming out of essentially an OPEC oil embargo that resulted from the fall of the Shah of Iran and the US's involvement in that part of the world and those kind of geopolitical events. Now we have the different kind of geopolitical events, as well as a culmination of pandemic issues that have caused this prolonged inflation. Once upon a time, people thought that this inflation was going to be transitory. And that's just not the case, right? And so we've got the Fed making a move. Bill, did you think the Fed should have made a more aggressive move?
That's a tough call. And I mean, really, to some extent, what you're getting at least in the first part of your of your comments, I think is spot on. Is that a lot of the responses that we're trying to gauge, and in fact, what the Fed's trying to gauge, is really how people are going to react. It's a little bit of a psychological game, and traders are and the markets are essentially then second guessing the actions that the Fed takes, and everybody is playing a game of chess in essence, trying to figure out what is everybody else going to be doing, what should the Fed have done, and what's the next shoe that's going to drop, so that they're well positioned for the markets a month, 6 months, a year down the road. Should it have gone even more? That's a tough question. I think that the markets could have withstood a 75 BIP adjustment. That would have sent even more of a shockwave through the economy than I think the 50 BIP bump did. And I think that that's one of the things that the Fed today is being extremely sensitive about is how much of a shock and surprise are they giving the markets. They need to give enough to send a message. They don't want to overreact, and that's something that Chairman Powell is extremely sensitive to, is overreacting.
He is, and so, but I think that part of his announcement was that the Fed was also prepared to make multiple 50 basis point moves through the remainder of the year. And so I think that if people are thinking, the Fed's only going to make a couple of moves and they're going to be maybe one big move and a couple small moves. No, I think the Fed's going to make another move. They'll get a pulse on where inflation is. Then they'll say, okay, inflation still isn't under control. Let's make another 50 basis point increase. And then a month later, they could do it again. And then they could do it again in 2 months. I think, by the time we're end of the summer, we may have seen 3 more 50 basis point increases. You're saying, can the market withstand this? I think they're going to keep doing it until the market says no mas, like, hey, let's, can you pull back a little bit? But by then you'll start seeing less transactions, which should have downward pressure on prices. So if they make all these moves and then we're seeing by the end of August, let's say a 5% year over year inflation, then, the Fed is doing the right thing. The wrong thing would be if you're seeing that and we're also seeing a huge decrease in GDP growth. Like if GDP growth turns negative, and it may have already been negative first quarter. So we've got some issues there. Hey Bill, why don't you tell me what this slide? Oh, go back 1 second, sir.
Oh, whoops.
Okay, so let's go over this slide because people are looking at this and saying, wait, what does this slide say? We're in a recession, we're not in a recession, what's going on?
Right, and so that's really the question on everybody's lips right now is, are we in a recession, are we not in a recession? And you've essentially got, I think, 3 legitimate answers. One, you can say, no, we're not in a recession. This is a transient event. Same thing Chairman Powell was saying, 9 months ago, maybe even a year ago, that this is just temporary price increases and everything's going to be fine and dandy as soon as we globally completely reemerge from the COVID crisis. You can say, yes, we've been in a recession, and a lot of the main force that's really pushed us here has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine that happened about 2 months ago. As a result of that, oil supplies have been dampened, grocery items have been hampered, and that's really been the thing that's kicked off the recession we're in now. Or option 3, actually, we've been dealing with a recession that's been going on since sometime during the previous administration. After all, Tom, something that we started talking about probably in early 2020, about the time that COVID hit, was the impact that production drops had been taking in 2018 and 2019. The bond yield curve had inverted a few times prior to that, and has continued to do so consistently every few months since then. And the impact on farm loan delinquencies starting in 2019 that has rippled across the economy. And at the end of the day, the point we're going to make here is, does it really matter? We're still dealing with, as you mentioned earlier, 8% inflation rates, something we haven't seen since the 1980s. We've started to see drops in GDP. Ultimately, putting a label on, are we in a recession right now, isn't really material. It's more of, how do we cope and what do we expect the next few months to bring?
Yeah, right. So, because say like someone says like, wow, so what if somebody came out and said we're in a recession right now? Well, one, the Business Cycle Dating Committee of the MBER, they're not likely to come out today and say that. They're usually very, very hesitant to point out the fact that we're in a recession, until maybe a year after we've been in a recession. So there are psychological elements. If we start seeing the movement in indicators, unemployment rates start going up, we still have this high inflation rate. We're seeing more loan delinquencies. We're seeing productivity falling, then let's say a layperson might say, geez, like, I don't think the economy is doing very well. They might start monitoring their behavior. They might start changing their behavior. And that can lead to even a larger decrease in GDP. So when people start saying, okay, I'm seeing lots of people lose their jobs, I keep hearing about this, things are bad, maybe I got to stop spending, which then could cause even larger decrease in GDP, which then push more people into believing that you're in an economic recession, which sort of then causes the economic recession that everybody thinks that you might be in anyway. That's a real challenge, right? And so we got to also think about the nature of this recession that we were in, and we were in a recession in May of 2020. The MBER Business Cycle Dealing Committee said that we were in a recession, a 2-month recession. If you read their release, they said the fact that they said we're out of a recession doesn't mean that they actually are out of a recession. It doesn't preclude them from coming back and saying, oh, by the way, I think we were wrong. It was, the shortest recession on record of 2 months. But, in 2008, even after the NBER said that we were out of recession, Nobel Prize winning economist Krugman said, look, we've actually probably been in a growth recession for, 2 or 3 years. And, some economists have said, yeah, that's a pretty good assessment. I mean, he does have a Nobel Prize. So we have to consider that somebody might come out and say, oh, by the way, like, we've been sort of in this kind of roaming recession kind of state for a couple years. What does it mean? Well, the fact that we've been in this K-shaped recovery, the haves have more and have-nots have considerably less. Yeah. Do you
Right.
want
I mean,
yeah.
I'm sorry, Tom.
No, I was going to say walk through a couple slides and then let's see if there's some questions here.
Yeah, so I was just going to wrap that up as well and point out the economy is fueled based on the ability to purchase items. So it's transferring money. If money's not flowing for whatever reason, either at the micro level or the macro level, then that's going to hamper the economy. And the thing that's been moving on, the thing that's been hampering the economy the last couple of years is the cases of COVID. Now, obviously, or maybe not obviously, COVID has evolved as a disease or as an illness, as a virus, through mutations over the past couple of years, starting out with the original strain, growing through a number of other strains. The main secondary one was Delta, and then Omicron more recently, and now a number of subvariants that are hindering supply chains around the world. The way that it's that the virus is attacking the supply chains is through the loss of labor availability. So Omicron is getting to a point that, and its variants, and I'm going to speak broadly here as an economist, not as a medical professional, but broadly speaking, it's approaching the level of intensity of a flu. There are vaccines available for it. They are widely available, in fact, and globally available. So the impact that we're expecting over the next year, COVID to have on various supply chains will be lessening, we expect, but supply chains right now are still extremely brittle as a result. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but want to turn our focus primarily to the U.S. Domestic situation. So unemployment, at least in March, the last numbers that we had when we put the charts together, nationally was at 3.6%. And that, you can look at the charts, and that's essentially where we were for several months prior to the beginning of 2020, when COVID disrupted everything, both domestically and globally. So just take that as one data point. And looking at the map here that we put together that shows the unemployment rate across the country, Alaska is the only area right now that seems to be broadly impacted from a labor perspective in terms of the localized unemployment rate. Generally, across the entirety of the mainland, and even in Hawaii for the most part, we've been able to recover very well. And that may kind of make people scratch their heads and say something about, well, now I keep reading about jobs reports and the Great Resignation. People are leaving their jobs in record numbers. And what's happened is over the past year or more, a number of people did leave their jobs. They had significant war chests that they had amassed. They felt like they had an opportunity with COVID to reevaluate their lives and take chances while at the same time needing to provide childcare in unique ways. They were concerned about coming into contact with people. And a number of people said, I'm going to take the plunge and become an entrepreneur. After all, my guy down the hall from me in my 9-to-5 job, he did it, and he's now making 50% more than he was before because, well, he's got his current company or his old company as his first client. He's got another client, so I'm going to go do it too. Again, a lot of psychology at work of if it works for one person, hey, it'll work for me too. I can get rich. So some of that has worked, some of that's not. One of the things that's going to be interesting is to see how many of those entrepreneurs are able to stick with it in the long term. And we can see here, looking at this chart, that still the labor force has essentially recovered to where it was pre-COVID. Number of employed, number of unemployed is essentially where it was pre-COVID. It does not reflect the 8, 9, 7, 10% growth we probably should have had if COVID hadn't occurred. But the main thing that's interesting is the number of openings that companies have now in the US. It's over 11 million, which is a dramatic shift from the 6 or 7 million that it was pre-COVID. And that is what's fueling a lot of the interest, and it's pushing a number of companies to be very, very competitive and start bumping wages as a result. That is another force that's helping fuel in the inflation right now.
Yeah, I want to point this out. So, I mean, if you're looking at this graph, you say, well, then everything should be good. I mean, we look at this employment level graph here on the left that says, okay, right before we were employed at, I don't know, 157, right, million people.
160, yeah.
160 million people. So then this dropped, and then we come back, and now we're back to where we were pre-pandemic. So then we should be fine. Well, the counterfactual would be if the employment was growing at maybe 3.5% per year. So we've just missed out on 2 years of 3%, 3.5% employment growth. So where we should be is up here. Now we were here, we dropped all the way down, and then the economy would have naturally grown. And so then when we get back to where we would have been, right, there's still this gap between what the economy needs to move forward and where we currently are. So it's important to understand that just because we got back to where we were doesn't mean we're back to where we should be. It's two different things. And if we also look at labor force participation rate, which I think is the next graph here, our labor force participation rate is still significantly below where it was before. So we just don't have the number of people who are participating in the economy as we had previously. And so you can think about a number of forces are leading to this increase in price levels, right? This massive inflation that we have. One of them are all these supply chain kerfuffles that we saw, from 2 years ago, and maybe a year and a half ago and a year ago, where there was a mismatch between what producers thought people needed and what people really wanted. And that created a supply chain issue. And then that supply chain issue cascaded to other issues as well, right? So there's that. Then the second thing is, periodic closures because of these different variants knocking out, production, then leads to additional issues. The fact that the economy is growing, but we're not having people move into those positions is leading to additional issues. And those issues create a gap between the supply of goods that are going into the economy and the demand for the goods that are going into the economy. And because there's a gap, there's this upward pressure in prices. And so then the economy has to adjust. Markets just adjust. And as they adjust, they say, look, we have 6 units, you guys want 10, you're going to have to fight over them. And then so it becomes sort of this upward pressure in prices. I mean, if you just look at, let's say, what the current Corvette is selling for I think it's a good analogy for this, right? It's an $80,000 car, and you can buy one if you got $120,000. It's a very nice looking car. I am not being paid by Chevrolet or Corvette, but I mean, you can buy one, but the price is, much, much, much higher than the, Moroni sticker price. And that's what's going on. That's what's leading to this high inflation. I think Nicola had a question. Yeah.
Tom and Bill, I do have a question from Al. He said, all the trends seem to be upward at a sharper degree than pre-COVID. Do you expect that to continue and catch back up to where we should be?
I think it's going to continue, that the market pressures are much stronger right now to find an equilibrium point very quickly, much more than in the pre-COVID world. The reason being that in the pre-COVID world, you didn't have the artificial pressures that came from all the stimulus money that was flowing in the system, I don't want to say desperation, but the sense of urgency in order to maintain a lifestyle in the status quo. Housing had dramatically increased because all of a sudden there was very sharp pressure by people, along with an availability of capital, in order to get a hold of the rare asset, the rare commodity of this dream home in the perfect place when I'm going to be working remotely. I've got to make this happen, and I'm willing to pay the money that I've got in my pocket in order to do that, just as a for instance. So yes, there's a lot of very sharp pressure that's been compressed into a very tight cycle that is pushing prices to find an equilibrium point given demand. Is it going to continue indefinitely? No, I don't think that's the case. Is it going to continue in the short term? Probably. There are several things, and we'll talk about a few more of them as we get further down in the conversation. Supply chains are going to need to be restored and stabilized. The availability of products are going to need to be restored and stabilized in order for the volatile nature of the economy to pass. Tom, you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, so that Al had sent a follow-up and said that he was asking about employment levels. And so this is true. And this is the sort of the nature of the numbers as well, Al. And that is, we had such a huge drop in employment levels. And early on in the pandemic, I was writing about how this looked much more like the kind of trends we see, let's say, around New Orleans after a hurricane, or New Jersey during Hurricane Sandy or something, where you see this huge spike in unemployment. But then it usually comes down very, very quickly after the dust has settled, literally, right? In this case, you see this huge spike, and because of the nature of those huge movements, you end up getting you can get a very, very sharp, return. In this case, we saw a sharp return initially, and then now we're seeing these rates are moving at paces that are similar to what we saw before, at least for labor force participation rate. For the unemployment population ratios, they're moving a little bit sharper rate. And part of this has to do with who's entering, what timing they're entering. I don't think that we're going to see this, that is the speed at which people are re-entering into the economy, moving at a much faster pace than we are now. And I do think it's going to flatten out. And I think a lot of this has to do with how people are repositioning themselves in the market. So they get displaced, they then enter back in, a bunch of people get displaced, and a bunch of people enter back in. And so there's this huge, very, very sharp return to the labor force. And then the dust is still settling and people are trying to figure out where they are. So then the rate changes a little bit. And now, 2 years later, as people are still trying to figure out where they fall in the economy, I think we're going to continue to see the rates flatten.
So Tom,
yeah.
Does that answer Amit's question about, with the talks of recession, will the job market cool down in the near future? So that's what you're suggesting will happen.
Yeah, for Amit's question. So when people start talking about, we're in a recession, or the economy is heading for a recession, that actually can cause people to change their behavior. to say, okay, I was going to go out and buy a new flat screen, but I'm not going to buy a screen, or I was going to go on vacation. Maybe I'm not going to do that. Or, oh, we're in a recession. Uh-oh, maybe I got to do something differently, which can cause people to change their spending, which then changes firms' needs for workers, which can then cause a decrease in employment. I mean, there's lots of psychology that plays into this, but when the economy cools down, you tend to see lots of parts of the economy cool down. And one of the ways it cools down is by telling everybody that it's awful. It's no, when you say, oh, the economy's in bad shape, then people go like, whoa, I better not participate. I don't want to get caught. And that itself can cause the economy to slow down. It's a very, very tricky thing.
So what about, so Cordell asked a question, isn't it likely that the workforce participation will not meet demand for workers as the baby boomers are retiring?
Right, and I think that is one of the things that did happen in 2020 and 2021 in particular, was there were an unexpected number of retirements that took place. A lot of people, to Tom's point, were repositioning themselves, and baby boomers were saying, shoot, I'm 65, 63, I can get early retirement. My company's pulling back in order to be prepared for this crisis because they don't know what's going to happen. And this would have been in first or second quarter of 2020. I might as well punch out, take my gold watch, and retire to the beach in Costa Rica or Cancun or something like that. So one of the things I just put up was the change in labor force participation by age. And yes, there has been a drop. The 55 plus crowd in gold is down a notable amount. They're actually down right now, the largest amount as compared to where the employment force and the LFPR looked in October 2019. So on this chart, the zero line is the baseline of how the labor force looked in 2019. If you're above zero, then there is currently more participation by the population in the indicated segment. And below the zero line, then there's a lower percentage participation rate by that particular segment. So what we're seeing here is that you're getting a significant number of people in the 16 to 19 range that are now working more than were working pre-COVID. And in every other segment, especially as you roughly get older, you're seeing less participation. Now, I think that just off the cuff, this makes some sense. Kids that were planning to go to college have got increased competition because several people at that age actually deferred going to college and may even be questioning whether they want to go to college. So take a year off and work, earn money, go back and decide you want to if you go to college, you'll go to college when there is less competition for slots. The older you get, the more you're likely to be considering, do I really need to work this year? Do I want to simply retire? And so on and so forth. Now, will workforce participation bounce back? Yes, it will take time, but it's a certainty that it will. Are there more opportunities for the 40 plus crowd? That depends on a lot of factors, like what industry you're in, but more than likely, yes. Tom?
No, so I think that there's a changing landscape in how different classes of workers view the economy. Like there's just a changing perception, right? So the fact that we've got so many people who are working from home the last 2 years, and I know that my MBA students, I just taught a handful of them who are just about to graduate, and they said, well, I'm looking for a job, but I just want to work at home. I want to have a flexible schedule. And I'm thinking, wow, that's, I mean, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, you say like, okay, I have a job offer. How awesome is that? I'm going to go to work. Now people are like, I got a job offer, but they want me to come to an office a couple times a week. I don't really want to commute. And so, I don't think I'm going to take that job, and I'll wait for somebody who says, oh, sure, work, when you'd like, work from your house. I mean, it's a really different change in perception in terms of, well, there's so many jobs out there, which is the second part of it. There's so many jobs out there that if I don't like this job, somebody else is coming along, and then I can negotiate with them that I don't actually want to go into a office. I want to work from home on my terms. Okay, so yeah.
Or Tom, just to jump in, I apologize.
No, not at all.
To jump in, I'm kind of bored with my current gig and I want to try something new. And I think I've got the skills to go transition to this other vertical space where, like you just were getting into, they're willing to pay me $5K, $10K a year or more. So that's where it gets back to the great resignation and all the churn in the employment markets.
Yeah.
Bill and Tom, how does, you mentioned more people moving and becoming entrepreneurs. How does that impact these sort of economic indicators?
Well, people who are, they might not reveal themselves as going back into the workforce, right? So I mean, there's this decrease in like my participation rate. So now instead of working for somebody else, I'm going to work for myself. How they show up in some of these numbers is not easily identifiable. What we did see a huge number of new business startups, and a huge number of new business startups, right? New business licenses. The problem with this is that in order to do this, you're relying on either your own capital. So you go to your bank account and you take out a bunch of money, or you go to a bank and you rely on their capital to do this. And historically, in some industries, we see 50 to 60% failure rates in the first couple of years. Mm-hmm. Some industries, I've been told, wait a minute, some industries it's more than that, like 80% of new businesses fail. And it's not clear that people who were said, okay, I'm going to strike out on my own, chose industries where the failure rate was less than 50%. So we a huge number of people who went out and started new businesses. Now, with inflation and the economy cooling off a little bit, what's the likelihood of all of those people, or a fair number of those people, saying, whoa, that was not what I anticipated. It's really hard to work for yourself. That wasn't really what my goal was, my cup of tea, if you will. And that might play into the next round of numbers. So they could say, okay, wait, I'm not going to go find a job. And now I enter back into the labor force, but I enter back into the labor force as somebody who doesn't have a job. So then we see this uptick in unemployment. So that's what I think. I'm waiting for that shoe to fall. I think that's the next shoe to fall, is that all these people who are striking it out on their own, not all, a fair number of them, are going to find that it's not easy to be an entrepreneur, to start your own business. And it's certainly not easy to start your own business and maintain that business in an economy that's cooling off, or an economy that has so much question, so much in the air, if you will. I think that's tough. And I think a lot of those people are going to jump back into the labor force. And when they do, we're going to see unemployment rates tick up.
And I think that's actually a good place to get back to where we were talking about inflation, because if you think about those entrepreneurs who are now having to absorb increased operating expenses in the neighborhood of 5 to 10% that they did not originally intend on, I absolutely agree with you, Tom, that I would not be surprised to see a lot of those millions of new businesses suddenly have those entrepreneurs decide they need to close shop. Here we're seeing that the 8.5% inflation that you've mentioned a couple of times since we started today. And this is a mix of the purchasing trends for individuals across the US. Obviously, if you live in Florida, you're going to have different incurred increases in prices for things that you purchase, as opposed to someone who lives in rural Maine or in California. So to that point, looking only at inflation of energy, energy costs have obviously gone through the roof in the last several months. Since last June, we've gone from 24.5% year over year inflation to almost 33%. And a lot of this, you may say, well, you've got the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and that's cut off the Russian oil supply that we were dependent upon. Well, we were only actually importing less than 10% of domestic oil when Russia invaded. So that really has not hampered a significant, well, I shouldn't say significant, but an incredible percentage of the petroleum use that we had here in the U.S. Instead, a lot of the price gains have actually been driven by increased demand due to concerns of, is it going to be available tomorrow? A little bit of, I hate to say it, fear of missing out.
Right.
That's really what has been causing change in cost. I think, Tom, you started the meeting this morning talking about mismatches in supply and demand. And in this case, while supply has decreased a little bit, demand has increased as much as anything. Coming out of COVID, people going into the office because their boss says they have to, as well as concern that whether it's going to be available or not tomorrow, has really driven a lot of what's going on, at least at the pump.
So we have a few more questions on this. And sorry, Tom, did you want?
No. I was gonna say there was a question here. I apologize, Nicola.
That's all right. So Linda, I think more of a comment than a question about many of us had no choice as we were, in air quotes, aged out of the corporate workforce, replaced with younger workers, and needed to make a decision to start up our own businesses to survive. So that's just a comment. And then Misha says that it seems that laborers who are strong earners would be less likely to change their behaviors in this economy than others. Any comments on those two statements?
Well, to Linda's point, it's so there is a natural trend for some people to say, okay, look, I just don't fit in this system anymore. I think I gotta start out on my own, right? And so my wife, who's a very savvy business person, she's very, very strong-willed. She started her own business, maybe 14 years ago, right? Because she didn't like the way that the corporate side of her business was working. She said, I think I can do this better. I'm going to strike out on my own, right? So to Linda's point, there's always going to be a number of people who've decided, okay, this isn't my path. I need this path, right? And let's say historically, people make those choices and still some of them fail, like a fair number of them, even prior to the pandemic, 50% or 80% of some businesses, 80% of new restaurants fail in the first 2 or 3 years, right? And then 50% of new businesses on average fail in the first 5 years. That's just, if you just look at the numbers overall. There is no doubt that changing technology, especially, and automation is going to change the demand for people in the workforce in different ways. And so then entrepreneurial people will, let's say by choice, say, okay, I'm going to have to start out on my own. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be successful just because they're put in a position where they either have to accept the changes that sort of their corporate entity is forcing on them. It just means, it's tough being an entrepreneur. Right? I think that's just the truth of it. So I can appreciate what Linda's position.
Yeah, and frankly, I hate to pull this card out of my pocket, but the older, wiser, more experienced people are the ones who probably have a better sense of what they're getting into. They're more likely to sit down, put together a plan, and more likely to stack the deck in their favor as a result, more in favor of being successful, as opposed to, unfortunately, there was a good segment of entrepreneurs who did say things like I characterized in jest at the top of the show of, hey, Bob that used to work from me down the hall, he's out doing dry cleaning. He bought a dry cleaning business, or he's vacuuming people's homes. He's a handyman now and is killing it. Well, if he can do it, then I can do it too, writing my own app for the iPhone or something like that.
Right.
And unfortunately, it just doesn't necessarily translate. And you had a lot of he can do it, so can I, type of mentality that I think kicked in during COVID.
We get we got a question from Gary, and then there was a question from Warren.
Yeah.
So Gary's question has to do with guiding younger people in terms of their education. And so one of the issues, and always has been an issue with, let's say, different generations of workers, is that people put a different priority on now versus then. They have different time horizons, and they have different, let's say, discount rates. So then it sets up a different idea about, well, I need something now versus I'm willing to wait for it later, right? This is the whole, marshmallow experiment with kindergartners, okay? And so for as much debate as that would arise, so here's the deal. I think that a lot of younger people, and I teach hundreds of them every year, some of them have a good idea about, I'm willing to sacrifice, I'm willing to not buy things today because I'm going to study to become a doctor or a dentist, or I'm going to become a PhD physicist or something like this. This is my goal. I'm not going to consume now, and I'm going to consume later. And there's plenty of younger students who I see are willing to make those sacrifices. And then there's other younger students who say, nah, screw it. Like, who knows what the future brings. I'm gonna make all my consumption now. Their choice is much more myopic. How you educate them in terms of, things like compounding interest and, what's the benefit of starting savings early, and what's the benefit of, engaging in more education now. You'll have higher earnings in the future. There's a lot you can do to educate, younger individuals into understanding consumption now versus consumption later, but we've got to hit these participants much earlier. Like, we got to have a good education in let's say high school, to have them understand the difference between consuming now and consuming later. And that has to be ingrained. Like, you have to understand that there are different sort of consumption paths, and the path that you choose will decide your fortunes either now or later. You look at a lot of physicians and they say, oh yeah, I didn't even start my life until I was 32. Okay, well, that was a choice. Like, you decided that you were going to go to school for 10 years after undergraduate. So I agree. I think that there's a lot of education that we can impart on our younger generations, to say, think about your choices and think about what the impact of those choices make. There was another question. There was a question by
Tom.
Warren.
I just wanted to sort of add to that, because Gary's last sort of statement or question in here is, what future do you anticipate in terms of student loans? And you've got a child about to graduate high school, and I've got a couple.
Yeah.
And so student loans are part of the dinner table conversation. Do you get?
They are.
Not get them? So
yeah.
I think these young people are thinking about this, but how should we help them be thinking about student loans, which, are in the press a lot these days?
They are. And I have an older daughter who's been out of college for a number of years, and she's still paying. We're still paying back some of her student loans. We're paying them with her. And so she has some responsibility. She's got some skin in the game. We are taking care of some of that. And so here's how I'd say about this is that my wife, who is much more pragmatic about making sacrifices, I'm more like, let's just help her out a little bit more. And she says, no, she has to learn that she has to make a choice. That is, she wants to say, oh, I want to take the kids to a vacation. Oh, but I got all these student loan payments. Well, you made a choice by going to college, right? Your college set you up for a better career. And then now you got to pay these loans back. Now you have to make choices right now about what you do, right? Where do you spend your money? I think that there was a shift in expectations. Like, oh, I'll get a job that pays me so much more that I really won't have to make a choice. I can buy the TV and pay my student loan. Well, that's just not the way that most systems work. Like, there's opportunity costs, and there are choices. I think we have to educate, younger individuals as to what those choices really mean. And so that's where I see it in terms of people just have to reestablish that, yeah, when you go to school, you're doing this to increase your productivity, and student loans are part of the deal. And you shouldn't expect that the student loans are going to be waived. You're just going to have to make choices going forward. Now, that's not to say that it's not difficult. If you don't anticipate that things are going to cost you 8, 10, 12, and some energy, 30%, housing, 20% more than you did, then you're going to have to recalibrate as you go. But what that means is being quick on your feet and then making those calibrations so that you can pay your student loans and prepare yourself for the future. Save, invest, be active investor. Okay. So, I mean, I don't know what else to say about that. Like, I think it requires you to recalibrate constantly. Hey, Bill, there was a question by Warren, and I think that this is actually something.
And that'll actually help us move on. So he asked, is there anything the Biden administration could or should be doing to ease the supply mismatch with demand for petroleum? And Warren, I'm sure you're already aware that the Biden administration is already committed to tap into the strategic petroleum reserve that's been maintained for several years, actually since the 80s, I think it was established, to the tune of, what is it, Tom, 1 million barrels a day for 180 days, which should offset the loss in availability of Russian oil that has been banned since early March. Unfortunately, we're still seeing the price increases the way they are. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is intended not only for retail gasoline, that's intended to supplement petroleum that goes into all petroleum-based products, airplane fuel, yes, racing gasoline, all petroleum products are going to be supplemented by this easing. If your question is, should they be doing more? Should they be doing less? Should they do something different? Maybe in the form of capital supplements, something like that. I can't really answer the should. I'm sure that they could. As we come into summer, I know that there has been an order allowing for the increased use of ethanol in summer blends of gasoline to alleviate pricing at the pump. And that actually has an interesting combination of effects. Ethanol is made from vegetable oil, and that's actually one of the most significant exports from Ukraine. And we actually had a slide here about that. Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe. They're an extremely large wheat exporter, and they export 50% of the world's sunflower oil, as well as a number of other grains. So there's going to be increased demand for those grains, both in the US and moreover in Europe and parts of Asia that are also supporting the ban on Russian products as a result of the Ukraine not being able to get these products to market. So we're actually going to have an interesting combination of effects at the pump when summer blend of gasolines try to become available allegedly with increased ethanol, and yet the vegetable oils that go into increased ethanol, or the raw materials there, is going to be competition for them through other avenues.
There was a question by Linda. She had actually 2 questions. One of them was about recent employment studies indicating that more employers had plans to hire more workers. So that to that point, I think that they did have plans, right? When people are saying like, okay, is the economy doing well? Yes. Do I plan to hire more workers? Sure. Right. More competitive candidates will drive up wages, right? And wages are also being driven up by a mismatch between the number of workers who are available and the number of workers who are demanded, which then pushes prices up. So we've got this wage inflation. That's true. Although even with wage inflation, real earnings are down, so that you have more dollars in your pocket, but each of those dollars is buying slightly less. So even though it looks like your wallet is getting bigger, on average, the metrics suggest that your wallet is actually getting smaller. That's a challenge, and that's a troubling trend. So yes, I think employers were thinking about hiring more. how will inflation impact this decision? Not just inflation, Linda, but I think if people start throwing around the idea of a recession, so they say like, we've got this inflation, wait, Deutsche Bank's talking about inflation, Tom and Bill are talking about inflation and recessions. Other people are talking about inflation and recessions, everywhere I turn, inflation, recession, inflation, recession. The Fed is talking about this. Oh my gosh, I might have to pump the brakes. And so it is possible that you could find employers pulling back a little bit. My expectations were to hire 10 people, maybe we can do it with 6. Right? My expectation was to hire 5 people. Maybe we can do it with 2. But if your expectations were to hire 2 people, you might say, maybe we'll do it with 0. Or you know what? Maybe we might actually have to fire, Bob over here. Right? So that's the problem as you go into this recession territory, is that firms will modify their expectations. And that's the challenge that we had in the beginning of the pandemic, is that so many employers modified their expectations right away, but it was not in the same direction as consumers chose to participate. So people said like, oh, we're gonna ramp down production, and consumers say, no, I'm gonna go out and buy more. I don't think that that's what's going to happen during this particular recession. People aren't going to say, oh, let's go buy more. People are going to say, I'm going to buy less, but that's because of prices being so high. So I think people are going to modify those expectations, and they're going to hire fewer people. I wish that was not the case. I do not want to be the doom and gloom kind of guy here. Bill, why don't you be the doom and gloom guy? I want to be a big guy.
I don't want to be the doom and gloom guy. Pam, do you want to be the gloom and doom person?
I don't either. I don't either. Well, fellas, I would like to say thank you so much for your session today, for sharing all of your insights. And we're just so excited to have you back again.
We'll come back. We'll come back again when we know the economy is either on stable footing or when it's really falling apart, and then we'll go, oh my gosh, or we'll go, oh yay.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to thank you, and thanks again for all our participants. Want to share, as always, what's coming ahead for us on Business Over Breakfast. So you can see here on your screen, we've got the rise of virtual social technologies coming up on May the 19th. On June the 1st, we are excited to welcome Jesse Boxstead. He will give us some insights on how to derive strategic insights from data analytics using AI and machine learning. And it's a little bit of a sneak peek in behind the curtain of the course that he's going to be teaching in this August. And then we have a hopefully really interesting and exciting session coming up on June the 16th. Everything important in business depends on relationships. And so, as Nicola mentioned on the front end of our session this morning, we have some new courses we're launching. I wanted to call your attention to a couple of those. Of course, Jesse's session, but we are launching the next cohort of our coaching diploma program, both the foundations and the advanced course. Early bird registration is open now, and you get a 20% discount if you register for both. These are International Coaching Federation accredited diploma program, applies towards achieving that certificate. And then registration opens tomorrow for our, what we call our extended learning courses. They are our 4 credit courses. And I'm going to read you really quickly the list of some of the options that you've got available. If you're interested in finance, alternative investment, fixed income portfolio management, investment banking, global macroeconomic perspectives, and merger and acquisition. Marketing courses that'll be available are customer lifetime value, pricing strategy and analytics, and product and brand management. And then we also have a class on process analysis and Six Sigma. So if any of those are really interesting to you, please come check us out on the website. Those registrations open tomorrow. We look so forward to seeing you the first and third Thursday of the month, and happy Cinco de Mayo. Take care, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.